Studentenverbindung is the umbrella term for all kinds of fraternity-type associations in German-speaking countries, including Chor, Burschenschaften, Landsmannschaften, Turnerschaften, Sängerschaften, Catholic fraternities, Schwarzburgbund, Wingolf, and Ferialverbindungen. Less than 1% of all current students and living alumni in Germany are active members of a Studentenverbindung organization. Fraternities of this particular type are present in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Hungary, Latvia, and German-speaking areas and other communities in Europe and Chile. They consist of active members who are students currently enrolled in university, and the already graduated Alte Herren or Älteren Hohe Damen that have once been active in these corporations and now provide guidance and the necessary financial backing to the fraternity. The active students are commonly divided into four groups, with the Fraternons, the Burschen, and the inactive Burschen forming the fraternity's active core. The fourth group, the Chargierte Burschen, elected by the former group's democratic vote and entitled to decide over certain situations of everyday fraternity life. Common Chargierte, the senior, Consenior, and the Drittchargierte. The senior's task is mainly to represent the fraternity in an impeccable manner and to lead it. His word is statute. The Consenior assists the senior but mainly focuses on imparting the fencing practice, the organization of fraternity events and the constant contact to female fellow students, whilst the Drittchargierte is in charge of the male correspondence, finance and diplomacy. There is a function that is often wrongly referred to as a charge, the so-called Fuchsmajor. He is in charge of the Fraternons and teaches them everything they need to know to survive in the fraternity life, except the fencing. Active and inactive members of older fraternities, who often possess large mansions, reside in the Verbindungshaus. It usually consists of a dorm and common rooms for festivities, the most notable of which is the night, where regular celebrations involving student songs and traditions are held. One of the many benefits of joining a fraternity in Germany is the especially low pricing of the often rich rooms, as Studentenverbindungen are much less present in campus life in comparison to U.S. fraternities. Some actively try to recruit new members through these low-priced rooms. After a certain period, the Fuchsenzeit, these new members have the opportunity to learn the traditions. Upon successful completion of all tests and examinations, they are usually offered full membership or, if they failed, asked to leave. Once finished with higher education and starting a career, the inactive Burschen are asked to resign from the fraternity's core members and become Alte Herren affiliates. This involves losing influence in the active fraternity life and vote in the core fraternity's democratic process, allowing younger generations to take the place. Major decisions, though, are still made by an annual committee where every member, student or not, has at least one vote. The Alte Herren Commission, which represent all Alte Herren, usually have double votes and veto rights. They are also taking care of the financial overview, supervising the Verbindungshaus, and so forth. Furthermore, all Alte Herren are commonly asked to pay a certain annual sum to help sustain the fraternity fiscally, to actively participate in democratic decisions concerning only Alte Herren, and to pay regular visits to the fraternity's festivities. A very peculiar characteristic of this structure is that the link between active members and Alte Herren is usually so direct that already the youngest members are asked to address even the most decorated Alte Herren by du, the intimate form of salutation in German, or even by the first name. This commonly includes referring to one another as Verbindungsbrüder, as it is possible for any Verbindung to forge treaties with another. This may be extended to members of other fraternities, too. This unpretentious relation between the old and the young allow the active members to learn how to bear responsibility at first hand. Tradition. To laymen, the most well-known tradition of Studentenverbindungen is the Mensur, a special form of very strictly regulated, fixed-stance fencing ritual. The Mensur is practiced with sharp blades, and although the body is well protected, it allows for deep facial and cranial wounds, which often result in a scar which is called schmiss. The schmiss was once regarded as the passport to a better future, as the Mensur strives to educate physical and mental strength by confronting the combatants to a rare and extreme situation. In modern times, opinions differ, although the principle stays the same. Whereas one would formally engage in a Mensur to be hit, many fencing students of today will rather engage in combat in order to prove their competence by not being wounded, instead focusing on reinforcing the bond of the entity of the fraternity. Fraternities that are not practicing academic fencing have other rituals that are meant to substitute this ritual of group dynamics, such as extreme hiking. While the Mensur is the most central principle to some Verbindungen, especially of the core Burschenschaften and Landsmannschaften, these organizations require the members to partake and stand the man. Other Verbindungen allow the members to practice it voluntarily, whilst most do actually forbid the members to fence. In particular, Christian fraternities decline the Mensur from general ethical perspectives, with Catholic fraternities even being formally restricted on the ground of the fifth commandment, "You shall not kill," which includes the integrity of the God-given body in general. Visually, the most discerning characteristic of many Studentenverbindungen is the so-called Kula, which can consist of anything from a small part of ribbon worn over the belt to elaborate uniforms with riding boots, sabers and colorful cavalry jackets, depending on circumstances and tradition. Most commonly, a sash displaying 3 distinctive colors is worn in everyday life. This is called ban. Such display is not as present at universities anymore as it used to be, however, despite other statements not prohibited at German universities, as the freedom of action is a basic liberty. Other visual characteristics are manifold. The circle, a cryptic symbol containing the fraternity's name and the letters V, C, and F for lat. Vivat circulus fratremilat, vivat crescat. Floreat may often be found on clothing or other personal items. Sometimes, the fraternity's coat of arms is also incorporated into objects, such as headgear or eqt. A good portion of fraternity members can be identified through the circle, worn visibly or involuntarily, by less obvious codes such as a certain style of dressing, e.g. Timberland boots and polo shirts. Furthermore, rare figures of speech can give the hint that a person is a member of a Verbindung. More elaborate uniforms are usually worn at night or, more formally, commas, a kind of gathering only still preserved at Studentenverbindungen. Such events can happen regularly but as well take place during holidays, for example to celebrate Christmas, to commemorate a deceased brother, or in remembrance of historic events or important dates in the fraternity's history, e.g., the founding day of the fraternity. During these gatherings, the crowd of members and guests present are presided over by the chargete, with the senior conducting the gathering, executing certain rituals, from as simple as welcoming guests, holding speeches, to performing the so-called Landesvater. The latter is a ceremonial where a saber is pierced through the Kula-bearing headgear of the participants in a complex ritual, accompanied by a ceremonial chant. While such rituals are only performed on the most solemn of occasions and thus very rare, a night commonly involves the lighter sides of life, such as rampant beer consumption and uninhibited singing of traditional student songs, of which some can be bawdy for the standards of time. Thus, this allows to get to know otherwise daunting members on a personal level due to the relaxed atmosphere at these gatherings. History. Early history. As the first universities formed in Paris, Bologna and Salerno around the 12th century, Europe was divided into a large number of small states, which reflected itself in the composition of the student body. To ensure an equal influence on the university's decisions, the students and teachers began to form nations, with one nation for each native state of its members. This basic tradition was continued for a long time and still survives in Sweden to the present day, as the first universities of the Holy Roman Emperor of the German nation were founded in Prague, Vienna and Heidelberg in the 14th century. They established a similar system, the Burs. Students were forced to live in a dorm assigned by the native state and soon started taking up formal signs, often colorful clothing, to display the membership in a Burs. This continues in the colored sashes worn by modern Studentenverbindungen. When the first duels were fought exactly is not known, as students were allowed to carry acute PEAQTs or sabers to be able to protect themselves and to deal with confrontations between rival groups. In the 17th century, the respective sovereigns gained increasing control over their Burs, and the first fraternities were formally formed, calling themselves Landsmannschaften, giving themselves Latin names according to the country of origin and introducing Fuchs and Bursch as status designations. Lifelong membership, though, was not known. During this period, the regulated duel was developed, accompanied by the idea to defend one's honor with a weapon and a strict code to guide the confrontation. This potentially lethal tradition continued until 1933 in Germany, with being so strict at some points that e.g., a Prussian officer could be expelled if he was not willing to demand or give satisfaction. As the Landsmannschaften faded during the early 1800s, secret organizations known as Studentenorden took the place and introduced elaborate rituals, formal oaths of membership, a strict constitution to regulate internal behavior, and cryptic symbols to identify members. All of these traditions are still known and actively practiced in today's fraternities. The Studentenorden, though, were heavily monitored by the then absolutist government, as many of the traditions were derived from Freemason or Illuminati lodges, and were subsequently banned at the end of the 18th century. Early 19th century, as Studentenorden were dissolved and the former members sought a possibility to continue the traditions, they began rebuilding a similar form of community under the then common and insuspicious French word corps. Symbols, oaths, regulations and rituals were continued from Studentenorden tradition, and the Latin names, status designations and affiliation with a country of origin were copied from the now extinct Landsmannschaften. A new characteristic was the heavy influence of German idealism, in particular the works of Kant and Fichte. This resulted in a strong focus on forming young members to be strong, upright and honorable, in order for the nation's best and brightest to spread these ideas throughout society. Political, especially geopolitical activities of corps as a whole were actively discouraged, as social commitment was seen as more promising and less controversial. Another characteristic was to unify all of the cities, and ultimately Germany's corps under an umbrella organization and to vote on common rules and principles for each corps to abide by. Hence the KSCV was created in 1848. The oldest, still existing Studentenverbindung, Ferialverbindungen.Less, 1789, was a founding member. Burschenschaften rebellion against aristocracy. The corps soon saw themselves heavily confronted by the Burschenschaft, which was first founded in 1815. sparked by the nationalist sentiment after the Napoleonic Wars. The members of the latter perceived the traditional forms of fraternities, who were still heavily affiliated with their state of origin, to be reactionary and elitist. Thus, they organized themselves into what was pictured as a single fraternity spanning all states of German language, allowing the students to coordinate a nationalist revolution, i.e. a revolution to unify Germany and to abolish all princedoms. For the beginning, they were a dedicated political organization, in contrast to the corps. This early attempt failed in 1819 when the Burschenschaft was fragmented, but the sentiment prevailed. At this occasion, the modern German colors are mentioned for the first time in popular culture, in a song by August Daniel von Binzer citing the colors of the Burschenschaft, Karlsbad decrees. In the same year, due to general anti-Semitism prevalent in any social class, massive anti-Semitic protests, mainly fueled by students, craftsmen and traders, swept the German-speaking states, injuring and killing many. As a result, by the Karlsbad decrees, any self-regulating student body was forcibly dissolved, severe censorship and punishments were instituted, and government authority was significantly increased. This resulted in secret gatherings and smaller revolutionary acts, many of which are seen as the foundation for a German nation in today's world, such as the Hambach Festival in 1832, where the German colors flew as a flag for the first time, and the Frankfurter Wachensturm in 1833, a failed attempt to take a large city's treasury to fund a revolution of 1848 and subsequent diversification. Tensions started to build, with short-lived, illegal fraternities forming, being dissolved and reforming at all universities, peaking in the German Revolution of 1848, in which many members of Studentenverbindungen took part. Although the unification of Germany, according to the principles of the Burschenschaft, soon failed violently, the Studentenverbindungen had emancipated themselves, and many of the members of the first Frankfurt Parliament were in fact core students of Burschenschaft members. Thus, the general concept flourished quickly, and soon, the Studentenverbindungen were no longer seen as clubs of young rowdies and revolutionaries, but as a valuable school for the future. This allowed Alte Herren to identify with the active members of the fraternities, and the idea of a lifelong commitment arose. Soon, the first Stiftungsfest, annual festivities in celebration of the fraternity's founding, were celebrated, further cementing the standing. As increased liberty allowed it, a more regulated form of duel was conceived, the modern Mensur, which strived to reduce lethality rates while still being able to fence. The former objective, though, was greatly impaired by treatment possibilities, with infected wounds posing a substantial risk. During this time, the first Christian fraternities were established by religious students missing belief as a basic principle of unity. Although some of them still took up weapons, many refused to differ from an ethical and religious standpoint. They often carried generic names, unifying themselves under an umbrella organization such as the ecumenical Wingolf. When the Catholic religion was beginning to be repressed during the Kulturkampf, a large number of fraternities of Catholic belief were formed as a reaction. The first organization of decidedly Catholic origin was the Schweizerische Studentenverbindung in 1841. These Catholic fraternities understood themselves as an important network to counteract the Kulturkampf. In 1848, a Germany-wide association of corps was founded in Bad Kösen, the so-called Kösener Seniorenkonventsverband (KSCV). It consisted solely of the old corps present at traditional liberal arts colleges and excluded those at technical colleges. In reaction, the Weinheimer Senioren Convent (WSC) was established, which unified the latter. Today, the two umbrella organizations are tightly linked by a cooperation treaty, known as DICOR. The types of fraternities soon diversified, and formerly informal clubs, such as sports clubs influenced by the political ideas of Turnvaterjahn, academic choirs, and groups influenced by the progressive movement were reorganized, each with the namesake as the central principle and idea of character building. Landsmannschaften or Westphal in Munster is the oldest Studentenverbindung of modern constitution. It was founded in 1716 in the city of Leipzig. A notable exception from these self-centered principles is the VVDSD, which had a strict anti-Semitic policy and was formed in 1881 as a decidedly political group. As a reaction, the first Jewish fraternities were established in the 1880s, prevailing until the National Socialist regime. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism and a former Burschenschaft student, was soon made an honorary member in many of these fraternities. Furthermore, Jewish fraternities were heavily focused on emancipating themselves through dual and mensur. Finally, around the break of the century, women were admitted to visit universities, unifying to sororities in 1899. The first such organization was the Club der Namenlosen, that was soon renamed to Verein Studierende Frauen Deutschlands Hilaritas. This diversification progressed to the point that the formerly despised students' culture or heavily influenced society, especially affecting the language. During the Wilhelminian era, this development peaked, with the largest part of the academic community being member in one or more of the over 1,300 fraternities, and even non-members cutting themselves with razors to simulate the appearance of the characteristic fencing wounds. As of today, Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II still remain the most well-known of course students and German fraternity students in general. First World War, Weimar Republic and National Socialist rule. This lasted until the First World War, which called all of the active students to serve the country, which many welcomed euphorically. Fatalities substantially decimated the number of fraternity students and students in general. When the war was lost and the Kaiser was forced to step down and hand over the power of state to a democratic government, the fraternities' world shook in its foundations. The violence the students had experienced at war, the uncertainty of the Weimar Republic times, and the deeply felt humiliation of the harsh conditions of the Peace of Versailles caused many fraternity members to enlist in the newly founded Freikorps, paramilitary organizations thought to protect democracy. As open battles between Freikorps members and communist activists began, many quickly radicalized throughout society, resulting in formerly non-political fraternities developing an extreme nationalist, anti-communist and anti-Semitic standpoint. As this was a fertile ground for the newly founded NSDAP to flourish on, many soon committed themselves to its principles, with some, such as the Burschenschaft, expelling Jews as early as 1920. When the NSDAP seized power in 1933, many rejoiced, although it was soon made clear that Studentenverbindungen would not be allowed to persist. There are several exceptions, though, most notably the Corsaxo Borussia, whose members loudly discussed on different occasions if the Führer were to eat his asparagus with his knife, his fork, or his paws, coming to the conclusion that he had so large a gap he would be able to eat it crosswise. This led to all Studentenverbindungen being classified as reactionary, and most of them either dissolved themselves or were forcibly closed during 1934 to 1938. The former members were then reorganized in Kameradschaften and forced to omit the principles of democratic vote, lifelong cooperation, honor and tradition, in secrecy, though many of the former customs were still practiced, although with the outbreak of World War II, few remained to do so during the war. Post-war times. After the war, the remaining former members soon tried to reorganize themselves, often fusing to a more Verbindungen to allow for greater impact, such as Gästeferialverbindungen and Gästeferialverbindungen, although this was at first made illegal by the occupation forces and universities. They slowly gained a foothold in society again. Special influences on this include several court decisions, amongst which are the decision that the mensur does not violate moral code in 1951, that public display of fraternity colors cannot be punished by expulsion from the university, and the forced acceptance of the last fencing fraternity in Berlin in 1968, and the formal obligation to head of state Theodor Heuss to abolish duels for honor. One side effect is that, due to this persistent struggle back to acceptance through legal action and sheer will of survival, post-war fraternities in Germany, unlike the pre-war selves, did not receive any university funding, but had also become completely free and independent of university regulation or oversight. While this allowed for progress, and such was achieved during the 1950s and early 1960s, the Verbindungen again took a hard hit in 1968 with the general socialist sentiment amongst the student movement and the desire to abolish anything deemed reactionary. As of today, many of the prejudices then expressed still formed the base of what little is known to the public about Verbindungen, resulting in a slow and steady decline in membership count since. A notable upswing was only delivered by the recent Bologna process, depriving students of long-known means of studying and thus increasing the demand for assistance by experienced alumni. As of 2013, a bit less than 1% of German university students are active members of a Studentenverbindung. The most prospering Studentenverbindungen can still be found in cities and towns with traditional liberal arts colleges and universities like Göttingen, Bonn and Heidelberg in Germany, with Munich being an exception. Traditional structures have mostly been preserved, with rituals, codes of honor, symbols and principles still intact. Most Studentenverbindungen still are restricted to only one gender, with the male varieties actively practicing the mensur. However, many have formally repented the presumed mistakes, with memorials of unjustly excluded Jews, for instance, being a common sight in a Verbindungshaus.